change how you feel about this? You know, when the person who's helping to, who is not living in the house, but who's waiting for the house to be sold, let's say when the kids graduate from high school, and you're continuing to be joint owners on the house, that person is waiting for their money. What happens when they have a new spouse who wants to buy a house, but most of that person's money is tied up in the house? So you also have to consider what some of the reverberations are of this decision and what the repercussions can be for holding on to something jointly for more than a couple of years. People may be getting along now and then they stop getting along, or they may not be getting along and then they start getting along. So things really can change. And then what happens if there's a foreclosure? Or there needs to be a short sale. What about paying the mortgage late, since it's going to affect both parties' credit scores because the loan hasn't been refinanced? If the person in the house pays the mortgage late one time or twice, is there some sort of a penalty or a give back, or what happens with that? And at what point do you decide that the house has to be sold? Sometimes people will say, I want to pay, instead of paying the child support, I'm going to pay the mortgage. And there's ways of drafting that in the judgment, but you want to be careful too of the monetary control issues that come with something like that, that it's not really my business how you spend the child support, yet it is my business how our joint credit is dealt with when you haven't refinanced the mortgage. So as you can see, it really is, there's a lot of things. And the person who's paying down the mortgage balance, who's, let's say it's not an interest-only loan, that it is a fully amortized loan, the person who's paying down the mortgage balance, do they get credit for doing that, or are their payments treated more like rent when they're occupying the house and you're waiting to sell it later? Then when is it time to sell? Who decides? Is it automatically time to sell when one person wishes to sell, or is there, let's say, the person occupying the house, are they the person who's the tiebreaker? Is it tied to a specific event, like the youngest child graduating from high school or somebody getting remarried? Sometimes that makes sense to do it that way. If I am living in the house and I get remarried, then I have, say, a year to refinance or sell. If I, refinance if I'm going to buy you out, or to sell if I'm not, and then who has the right of first refusal to buy the house? Perhaps the person who has the occupancy of the house has the first right of refusal, but before you put it on the market, maybe the other person would rather buy it. And then how do you establish the buyout number? I mean, obviously people could make an agreement as to the value. They might get 3 comparative market analyses, which is when you call up a realtor and ask for them to do, they call them a CMA, a comparative market analysis. Those are free of charge. Sometimes we suggest that people get 3, though, because if a realtor thinks that there's a possibility that they'll get the listing, sometimes they will give you a very optimistic view of what the house is worth, versus if they don't think they're going to get the listing. You might want to do a formal appraisal by an MAI certified appraiser. If you're going to do a buyout, you could do a bank refinance appraisal. The issue with that, though, is that the bank refinance appraisals tend to be pretty conservative because the appraiser works for the bank, even though you've hired them, and they're really worried about protecting the bank's interest. And so you need to be careful about using a bank refinance appraisal, or at least know going into it that it is likely to be lower than those CMAs or even a formal appraisal. By the same token, if you need that bank appraisal in order to get the loan, maybe that is the value, because that is going to set the cap on the amount of money that you can borrow. So unless you have other funds that you can use to augment what the payoff is, your bank refinance appraisal is going to be, even if it is low, maybe it is the benchmark. Because remember, when you're not selling the house, when you're buying and selling between each other, you are saving the realtors and other closing costs. I mean, there is a cost for the refinance, but it's a fraction of what it costs to refinance a house, so, or a fraction of what it costs to sell a house. So taking a little bit less on the number may actually, you may actually come out ahead than if you had sold it to a private third party. So is there a sell-by date? For example, a child's graduation, a remarriage, or a specific date, maybe 2 or 3 years down the line. Are there triggering events for sale or buyout? And if so, what are they? You want to specify all these things in the judgment. And is any of this influenced by any drop in equity or an increase in value? I mean, are you going to sell when the house gets to be a certain number, whether that's a good number or a bad number? So your judgment provisions are going to need to include how joint ownership would work, according to this checklist that we've talked about, procedures to follow when there's been a disagreement, or one person wishes to sell and the other one doesn't. If one person is staying in the house and the other is moving out, you might want to include drafting such as the person staying in the house, use their name, has exclusive use and possession of the family home, and then give the time period. By drafting this judgment this way, you actually preserve the capital gains tax exemption for the house for both spouses to combine, as long as the other spouse doesn't need his or her exemption meanwhile. That's a mouthful, right? So when you sell your house, if you've lived there 2 of the last 5 years, each individual spouse has a $250,000 capital gains tax exemption. When you've got 2 spouses, that's a $500,000 exemption because it's 2 times $250,000. When you use the words exclusive use and possession of the family home, even if you continue to own the house jointly after the divorce, when you use the words exclusive use and possession and you haven't turned the title over, because it's a court order, the IRS, this is one of the many favorable things that the IRS actually does for divorced couples. You can preserve that last 2 out of 5 years. So let's say you're out of the house for 3 years, waiting for a child to graduate, and then you sell the house. By using those words, exclusive use and possession, even though you haven't lived there for 2 of the last 5 years, you can still use your $250,000 capital gains tax exemption because of this special IRS provision. And so that really can be a help for people because the capital gains tax that would be due on $250,000 can be a lot of money. So you want to make sure that you help people utilize this because every dollar counts in a divorce. There are actually a lot of really good IRS provisions that help people who are getting divorced. I'm not sure who in the IRS code drafting chain of command got divorced and wanted to help people, but there's a lot of good tax advantages you can take advantage of, and so you want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with this. Also, if parties have not owned a house for 2 years, which is usually the threshold to make that capital gains tax exemption, you have to live there 2 out of 5 years. Let's say you've only lived there for 18 months, but you're getting divorced. Divorce is also considered a hardship for those purposes, and so you get to utilize 2 years is 24 months. You get to use 18/24 of the capital gains tax exemption, 18 being the 18 months that you lived there. So they give you a break, whereas if you weren't getting divorced or didn't have this kind of a hardship, you wouldn't be able to utilize it at all. And so, the IRS is trying to give divorcing folks as much help as they possibly can, which I think probably is a good long-term strategy because you don't want these people ending up on welfare or in any kind of any more financial trouble than most divorcing people get into anyway. So make sure also if you're not going to refinance or sell a house that you've got indemnification provisions for any mortgages, loans, or obligations regarding the house. And some draft paragraphs are in the materials so that you can use those to tailor for your own cases. And then ultimately, the court you want to specifically state in the judgment that the court retains jurisdiction over the issue of joint ownership of the house in the event of a dispute between the parties, which they're unable to resolve on their own or using mediation because you don't know what's going to come up. And because property settlements are final in the final judgment and they are not subject to modification by the court unless there was fraud or mistake or the parties agree that they should be modified, you want to make sure that when you need to retain jurisdiction that you do so specifically so that the court is able to come in and fix any issue that comes up that you didn't think about or that the parties didn't think about. It's not all about sloppy judgment drafting that gets people into trouble. You don't know what's going to happen. People don't plan on getting multiple sclerosis. They don't plan on getting in a car accident. They don't plan on their house value, being in half 2 months after they buy it. There's all kinds of things that can happen to people. And so when you have something that you can foresee that there may be a big change, that maybe you can't predict exactly what it's going to be, asking the court to retain jurisdiction over one particular part of the judgment can be important. You don't want to do that for every provision because you don't want people's lives to be a continually changing mosaic, right? You don't want it to be a kaleidoscope for them, but if you have specific things that you want to make sure that they're able to go in and fix if things come to pass that were unforeseen.